Live service games. They can be colossal hits, but more often than not, they turn out to be gigantic failures. Today, we're going to break down why some games like Helldivers 2 and Destiny 2 succeed, while others like Concord, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and Redfall have crashed and burned. It seems like every studio is trying their hand at live service, and while their failures are for different reasons, the real reason why so many studios chase the live service model often boils down to greed, rather than a genuine desire to craft an evolving, immersive experience for players. Take Marvel's Avengers or Anthem, for example. These games weren't just flawed, they were clearly built to milk players for every cent, prioritizing monetization over quality gameplay. And contrary to what these companies think, we aren't oblivious. We recognize when we're being exploited, which is why so many of us choose to abandon these games altogether. In this video, we're going to uncover what really sets games like Helldivers 2, a project from a small studio, apart from the multi-million-dollar flops like Concord. How can a game with a modest budget and a passionate team outperform a $200 million blockbuster from a so-called AAA developer? We'll dive deep into the truth behind these successes and failures, peeling back the layers of hype, greed, and what players really want. Stick around because we're about to uncover some hard truths that you definitely don't want to miss. And remember, it's only GG when you win. At first glance, Marvel's Avengers had everything going for it. Beloved characters, a rich universe, and an audience eager to step into the shoes of their favorite superheroes. But the excitement wore off fast as players hit roadblock after roadblock. The game was plagued by buggy updates, uninspired content, and a progression system that felt more like a chore than a reward. Many players couldn't shake the feeling that this was less about delivering a great Avengers experience and more about squeezing as much cash from fans as possible, especially when faced with predatory microtransactions in a game that was already sold at full price. The biggest issue, though, was that Marvel's Avengers just didn't make players feel like superheroes. The thrill of powerful combat was overshadowed by a grindy loot system that seemed lifted straight from other live service games with little thought for how it fit the superhero genre. The core gameplay loop, which should have been fun and empowering, instead felt tedious and repetitive. Players wanted epic moments, not endless grinding. Another major misstep was the disconnect between the developers and the community. Players voiced their frustrations repeatedly on forums and social media, but instead of focusing on core gameplay improvements, the studio doubled down on pushing out more cosmetic content and features that forced the player to spend even more money. The lack of genuine engagement with their audience only further alienated fans, who felt like their feedback was falling on deaf ears. Ultimately, Marvel's Avengers serves as a cautionary tale for live service games. It had all the ingredients for success, but poor execution, misguided priorities, and a failure to understand what players truly wanted turned it into a high-profile failure. This wasn't just about bad monetization, it was about losing sight of why people play games in the first place: to have fun, to feel powerful, and to be part of something bigger than themselves. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodhunt launched with an exciting premise: a battle royal set in the dark supernatural world of Vampire the Masquerade. It had all the potential to stand out in a crowded genre, but despite its unique theme, the game failed to maintain a substantial player base, leading Sharkmob to officially cease active development in 2023. So what went wrong? From a player's perspective, the issues went beyond just surface level critiques. Bloodhunt showed promise, but ultimately it felt half-baked to many. The core gameplay, which combined vampire abilities with battle royal mechanics, was fun at first, but it lacked the depth to keep players coming back. The excitement wore off quickly, and many players described it as enjoyable in short bursts, but ultimately repetitive with little meaningful progression to sustain long-term interest. One of the biggest complaints from the community was the lack of meaningful updates. Sharkmob was slow to deliver new content, and this left many players feeling ignored and abandoned. In a genre that thrives on constant updates and evolving content, Bloodhunt's stagnation was a death knell. Players felt that the developers simply gave up too soon, and that lack of ongoing engagement sapped any lasting enthusiasm for the game. Technical issues also plagued Bloodhunt, from inconsistent combat mechanics to frustrating matchmaking. The vampire abilities that initially set the game apart weren't enough to compensate for these shortcomings. While the game had flashes of brilliance, those moments were too few and far between. And when the mechanics didn't work, it made the experience more frustrating than fun. Bloodhunt's failure as a live service game highlights a recurring problem in the industry: the inability to sustain player interest through consistent content and genuine community engagement. Live service games rely heavily on keeping players invested over time, but Bloodhunt lacked both the content updates and the developer interaction that are crucial for long-term success. Instead of delivering regular updates or engaging events to keep the game fresh, Sharkmob's slow response and lack of meaningful additions made it clear that they weren't fully committed to the live service model. Players expect a steady flow of new experiences and a developer that listens to their feedback, but Bloodhunt failed on both fronts. Ultimately, Bloodhunt fell victim to a lack of communication and a failure to capitalize on its potential. Sharkmob's inability to introduce engaging post-launch content and connect with the community meant that Bloodhunt couldn't compete in an already saturated market. Though it remains online for a small dedicated group of players, the decision to end development stands as a clear indicator of its failure as a live service game. It could have been so much more if the developers had invested in its potential from the start. The lesson here is one that many live service games have struggled to learn. It's not enough to launch with an interesting concept. Success in the live service space demands constant care, engagement, and a willingness to evolve alongside the player base. Without these elements, even the most promising games are doomed to fade away. On to one of the most well-known live service failures, Anthem, the game that had all the hype and none of the follow-through. When Anthem was first announced, it looked like the next big thing. Picture this: soaring through the skies in mech suits, battling alien enemies in a massive open world. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, for gamers, it turned into a nightmare. The real heartbreak here: flying around in those javelins did feel amazing for about 5 minutes. But once the thrill of flight wore off, players were left with a game that felt unfinished, shallow, and kind of broken. The progression system was a mess, there wasn't nearly enough content, and let's not forget how many bugs this game had. Gamers across forums and social media ripped it apart, calling it more of an early access alpha than a fully launched title. And here's the kicker: many players felt Anthem was doomed from the start, not because of the concept, but because of EA's notorious live service model. It felt like BioWare wasn't allowed to build the game that they wanted. Instead, Anthem was pushed out the door too soon, half-baked, and built around making money rather than creating a memorable gaming experience. Corporate greed over player need? It sure felt like it, and that's why Anthem's fall was so painful. Anthem's story is yet another example of how live service games can go horribly wrong when studios lose focus on delivering quality gameplay and instead chase quick profits. The potential was undeniable. The world, the mech suits, the concept of dynamic open world missions, all of it could have made Anthem a hit. But without meaningful in-game content, a rewarding progression system, or a clear vision for long-term updates, players quickly lost interest. The result was a game that failed to retain even the most loyal fans. The lesson with Anthem, much like other failed live service games, is that it's not enough to promise a grand experience and deliver a flashy launch. Sustained success requires genuine investment in the player community, ongoing development, and the dedication to make the game better over time, not just use it as a platform for monetization. Anthem may have been built with high hopes, but it serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when a studio tries to build a live service game without the foundation needed to support it. Halo Infinite was supposed to bring the iconic franchise roaring back to life. When it launched, fans expected an epic return to form, but what they got was, well, let's just say it wasn't the glory days of Halo 3. The core gameplay, it was solid. Classic Halo combat that felt right at home. However, the problem was that the content pipeline was extremely slow, failing to keep up with even modest player expectations. Gamers on forums and social media weren't shy about voicing their frustrations, and the sentiment was loud and clear. Halo Infinite's multiplayer felt starving for content. Weeks turned into months, and players found themselves repeating the same maps and modes over and over. It wasn't just the lack of new content, it was the excruciatingly slow pace at which 343 Industries rolled out updates. For a live service game, keeping the player base engaged with fresh content is essential, and here, Halo Infinite fell way short. To make matters worse, the community felt like their feedback was being completely ignored. 343 343 Industries was criticized for taking too long to address key issues, making the multiplayer experience feel like it was stuck in development limbo. Players voiced concerns, but the responses and updates came at a pace that simply couldn't keep up with expectations. The result? A player base that dwindled as people moved on to games that offered more consistent and exciting updates. While there is still a loyal fan base fighting it out on the battlefield, Halo Infinite simply didn't live up to the high expectations that come with being part of such an iconic franchise. The initial excitement and promise of a grand return weren't enough to sustain the high player count and all-encompassing excitement that Halo is supposed to bring. The core gameplay had so much potential. It brought back the classic nostalgic feel of Halo, and the mechanics were as tight as ever. But without the consistent addition of new maps, modes, and events, it simply wasn't enough to sustain the hype. The live service model demands more than just solid gameplay. It requires a constant flow of content and a developer that listens to and acts on community feedback. Unfortunately, Halo Infinite missed the mark in these crucial areas. Halo Infinite serves as yet another reminder that a strong start isn't enough in the live service arena. The initial excitement can only carry a game so far if the support isn't there to keep players engaged. 343 Industries may have nailed the feeling of classic Halo, but without a robust and responsive live service strategy, even the most iconic franchises can struggle to keep players coming back. The lesson here? Live service success is about more than nailing the basics. It's about evolving with your community and delivering an experience that keeps them excited for the long haul. Next up, we have Fallout 76, a game that had fans of the Fallout series feeling excited one moment and completely betrayed the next. Following the missteps of other live service titles, Fallout 76 was supposed to be Bethesda's next big thing, a massive online Fallout world where players could explore the wasteland together. But when it launched, it was like stepping into a wasteland of broken promises. Fallout 76 quickly became the poster child for everything that can go wrong with a rushed live service game. Imagine booting up the game only to find empty worlds, no NPCs to interact with, and bugs. So many bugs. It didn't take long for gamers on forums and social media to slam Bethesda for dropping what felt like a half-finished product. The backlash was brutal, with players asking, where are the NPCs? Where's the story? What exactly am I supposed to be doing here? Fallout 76 wasn't just a game missing features, it was missing a soul. To their credit, Bethesda didn't just throw in the towel. They released patches, updates, and the Wastelanders expansion, which finally added the NPCs and meaningful content that should have been there from the start. But by then, the damage was done. For many, Fallout 76 will always be remembered as that disaster of a launch. And yet, here's where things get interesting. Over time, Fallout 76 has built up a small but fiercely loyal community. Despite the rocky start, there are players who stuck around, carving out a corner of the wasteland to call their own. Sure, it never reached the heights Bethesda had hoped for, and for many gamers it still feels like a cautionary tale about what happens when you rush a game to market. But for those who stayed, Fallout 76 became a flawed but beloved experience. Proof that even after a disaster, redemption is possible. Sort of. However, it's hard to ignore that the Bethesda behind Fallout 76 isn't the same studio that once gave us Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Skyrim. The Bethesda that crafted rich, immersive single-player experiences seems to have lost its way. Just ask Starfield. Fallout 76 is another prime example of the dangers of the live service model when executed poorly. The initial release lacked the necessary content to keep players engaged, and the absence of NPCs and story-driven elements made the world feel lifeless. Live service games require a foundation that keeps players coming back, and Fallout 76 simply didn't have that at launch. Bethesda's attempts to fix the game with post-launch updates helped salvage it to some extent, but it couldn't fully shake off the stigma of its disastrous debut. The lesson here: a rushed release, lacking core features, and a compelling player experience can doom even the most beloved franchises. And while redemption is possible, the path is long and uncertain. Battlefield 2042 was supposed to be a game changer, a futuristic twist on one of the most beloved FPS franchises of all time. Instead, it became a prime example of how to quickly lose a dedicated fanbase due to missing key features, not keeping promises, and failing expectations. Gamers were hyped for large-scale battles, epic destruction, and everything that made Battlefield legendary. What they got was bugs. missing features, and a game that felt more like an early access title than the blockbuster shooter it was promised to be. From the moment Battlefield 2042 hit the market, Twitter and Reddit were flooded with complaints. Players were baffled by the lack of basic features. No scoreboard, no voice chat, and balance issues that made the game feel more like chaos than controlled warfare. For a franchise that had built its reputation on delivering polished, large-scale multiplayer experiences, this was nothing short of disastrous. And while DICE, the developer, worked hard to patch things up, it was too little too late. By the time they fixed the glaring bugs and added the missing features, the damage was done. The player base had already moved on to other games in a crowded FPS market. Longtime fans felt abandoned, wondering why the features that previous Battlefield games had nailed at launch were nowhere to be found. Where was the care and attention to detail that had once defined the franchise? In the end, Battlefield 2042 didn't just fail because of technical issues, it failed because it lost the trust of its loyal fanbase. In a genre as competitive as first-person shooters, losing your core players is the death knell. The Battlefield may have been grand in scale, but Battlefield 2042 ultimately became a ghost town. Battlefield 2042 is yet another cautionary tale of what happens when a live service game fails to meet player expectations. The rushed release, lack of essential features, and unfulfilled promises alienated the community that had once been the franchise's backbone. Live service games need more than just a flashy concept. They need a solid foundation, attention to detail, and consistent communication with players to keep them engaged. Battlefield 2042's downfall highlights the dangers of overpromising and under-delivering, especially when it comes to an established series with high expectations. When Redfall was first announced, it seemed like it had everything it needed to be a hit. A co-op shooter set in a creepy town overrun by vampires, developed by Arcane Studios, known for their critically acclaimed titles like Dishonored and Prey. The idea of taking on vampire hordes with friends in an open world setting sounded like a blast. But when Redfall launched in 2023, it quickly became one of the most high-profile failures in recent gaming history. So what went wrong? Players on Reddit and Twitter didn't hold back, slamming the game for its unfinished state, lack of polish, and most of all, uninspired gameplay. The world of Redfall felt empty. The vampire AI was lackluster to say the least, and the co-op experience, one of the game's biggest selling points, was riddled with bugs and technical issues. For a game that promised so much excitement, players found themselves bored, battling repetitive missions in a world that felt half-baked. One of the biggest criticisms across social media was that Redfall lacked the depth and creativity that Arcane Studios was known for. Fans of their previous titles were expecting tight, immersive gameplay, but instead got what felt like a generic shooter with a vampire skin. Many even called it Arcane's most disappointing project, wondering if the pressure to fit into the live service model forced the game into a rushed and unfinished state. By the time Redfall's developers began addressing the major issues, the player base had already moved on. In May 2024, Microsoft decided to close Arcane Austin, the studio behind Redfall, as part of a broader restructuring effort following the game's disastrous launch. Despite the developers releasing a major update that added offline mode, revamped gameplay systems, and other improvements, it was too late to win back the players. The closure of Arcane Austin became a direct consequence of Redfall's failure, marking a somber end for a studio known for its creative, critically acclaimed titles. Like many live service failures before it, Redfall fell victim to releasing too soon, without enough content or polish to keep players interested. Despite the hype and potential, it became yet another reminder that no matter how strong the concept, execution is everything, and Redfall simply didn't deliver. Moving on to the most recent, and in my opinion most spectacular failure of a live service game, Concord. Sony's big live service bet in 2024 was supposed to make waves, but instead of dominating the charts, it flopped harder than anyone could have predicted, peaking at a jaw-dropping low of just 697 players on Steam. For a game with a massive budget, reportedly around $400 million, and high expectations, that number isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. So what went wrong? Gamers on Reddit wasted no time tearing into Concord, calling it out for all the right reasons. Poor character design? Check. Bland bland, derivative, uninspired gameplay? Check. And the most brutal critique? A complete disconnect between the flashy promotional trailers and the game we actually got to play. The hype made it look like the next big thing, but once players jumped in, they quickly realized it was more of a paint-by-numbers live service game than anything fresh or innovative. What really hurt was the feeling that Concord was just chasing trends. Gamers on social media didn't mince words, labeling it as a cash grab by Sony. It felt like they were throwing in all the live service buzzwords without offering any substance. Lack of content, little innovation, and zero connection to the community. These are the mistakes live service games keep making, and Concord managed to hit every one of them. Adding to the criticism was the political messaging present in Concord, which was seen as pandering rather than meaningful representation. The game included elements such as pronoun options and diverse character designs, but instead of feeling authentic, it came across as a box-ticking exercise. Many players felt that Sony was attempting to appeal to current social trends without properly integrating these aspects into the game's world or narrative, which only alienated more players. This perception became yet another point of contention that hurt the game's reception. In the end, Concord felt like the perfect example of how not to do live service in 2024. There are rumors that Concord may be making a comeback as a free-to-play game, but even if it does, the core issues that plagued its initial release, lack of meaningful content, shallow execution, and disconnection from the community, are still likely to prevent it from finding success. Gamers have seen it all before: empty promises, shallow execution, and a complete lack of heart. For a game with so much financial backing, its failure stands as a stark reminder that no amount of budget can save a game that doesn't listen to its players. Concord's downfall is yet another case study in the ongoing struggle of live service games. The problem wasn't just the technical aspects or a lack of polish. It was the complete absence of anything meaningful to keep players engaged. Sony may have poured resources into making the game look flashy, but they overlooked the core of what makes live service games successful: community involvement, innovative gameplay, and above all, a reason to keep coming back. Concord's failure shows that following trends isn't enough. You need to understand and connect with your audience if you want to succeed in this space. Kill the Justice League, a game that should have been an easy win. It had everything going for it: a legendary developer in Rocksteady Studios, the masterminds behind the iconic Arkham franchise, and a lineup of beloved DC characters. But somehow the game failed to meet expectations, and gamers weren't shy about expressing their disappointment. From the moment Kill the Justice League hit the market, players and critics alike blasted it for its uninspired gameplay. Sure, the concept was cool on paper. Teaming up as Harley Quinn, Deadshot, my favorite King Shark, and the rest of them to take down the Justice League, but the actual execution, it felt like a chore. The gameplay was grindy, repetitive, and the missions lacked any of that Rocksteady magic that made the Arkham series so memorable. To make matters worse, Suicide Squad fell into the same trap as so many other failed live service games: microtransactions. Players were hit with expensive, in-your-face monetization that turned what should have been a fun superhero beat-em-up into a wallet-draining grind fest. By mid-2024, the numbers told the story. Less than 120 players were still active on PC. While some gamers touched on the political elements of the character designs, that wasn't what sunk this ship. The real villain here was the lack of meaningful content. Post-launch updates either missed the mark or added elements that alienated players. The introduction of Mrs. Freeze in the Season of Frozen Hearts update felt forced, with her character portrayed in a politically charged manner that didn't resonate well with fans. Additionally, the new interpretation of the Joker, positioned as an Elseworlds variant, was met with widespread criticism. This Joker lacked the dark charisma and complexity that made him an iconic villain in past iterations, instead coming off as a shallow caricature with little depth or menace. Players felt that this reimagined Joker deviated too far from what made the character compelling, resulting in a version that felt disconnected from the established lore and unable to capture the essence that fans loved. These updates failed to bring the excitement and depth needed to rejuvenate interest, and with no compelling new content to keep players hooked, the game quickly turned stale. For a title with so much potential, Suicide Squad ended up being a textbook case of how even the biggest names and IPs can't save a game that doesn't deliver where it counts. Kill the Justice League serves as another example of a live service game that failed to understand its audience. The game tried to capitalize on beloved characters and a recognizable universe, numbers, but it lacked the depth and quality content needed to keep players coming back. The combination of grindy gameplay, aggressive monetization, and the absence of any compelling updates doomed it from the start. It's a harsh reminder that no amount of star power can cover up a lackluster experience, and without meaningful engagement, even the most promising games will fall flat. Helldivers 2 is the perfect example of a live service game that refused to die. It initially launched to massive player numbers, peaking at over 458,000 concurrent players. Almost the entire gaming community was legitimately hyped, but after release, the excitement fizzled fast. Early complaints flooded Reddit and YouTube, with gamers frustrated by a lack of content, repetitive missions, and subsequent updates that often missed the mark. Many of the early patches failed to address player concerns, focusing instead on minor tweaks that did little to improve the core experience. It looked like Helldivers 2 was headed straight for the dreaded dead game category. But here's where the story takes a turn. Instead of abandoning ship, the developers at Arrowhead listened. Eventually, after several updates that missed the mark, the team began to genuinely take player feedback to heart. Players were calling for more in-game content, better updates, more buffs to weapons, and more interaction from the devs. And guess what? Arrowhead delivered. With the recent patches, the game got significantly better. Arrowhead didn't just drop cosmetic updates or cheap additions. They brought meaningful, real changes that addressed the core issues players were complaining about. The latest updates overhauled the game's difficulty, weapon balancing, and added new content that players had been requesting for months. These improvements brought the player count back up to over 100,000 concurrent players, a peak not seen in months, and finally gave players the experience they had hoped for post-launch. Suddenly, Helldivers 2 started to regain momentum. The updates weren't just surface-level fixes, they made the game deeper, more engaging, and most importantly, more fun. Fans on social media started praising the game's transformation, calling it one of the best comeback stories in the live service world. What sets Helldivers 2 apart from other failed titles is how it turned things around by building a real connection with its player base. The developers understood that players wanted to be heard, and that genuine engagement was crucial for the game's survival. By actively listening to the community, Arrowhead prioritized the features and fixes that players actually wanted, making them feel valued. The devs weren't just pushing content, they were engaging with the community, responding to feedback, and showing that they cared about making the game something special. This two-way communication, which has only recently become a consistent trend, builds trust, and players could see their voices reflected in the changes being made. However, for Helldivers 2 to remain successful, Arrowhead will need to continue listening to the community and maintain this level of responsiveness moving forward. It's this willingness to adapt and evolve based on player needs that transformed Helldivers 2 from a near failure into an absolute standout success. And that's why, unlike so many other live service games, Helldivers 2 managed to rise from the brink of failure to becoming a model of how to structure a live service game. If there's one game that defines the highs and lows of the live service model, it's Destiny 2. This game didn't just survive the tough live service landscape, it thrived, but not without some serious bumps along the way. When Destiny 2 first launched, it had a rocky start. Players were frustrated with its limited content, shallow endgame, and let's be real, Bungie's overly aggressive monetization tactics. Gamers on Reddit and YouTube weren't shy about calling the game out, saying it felt more like a cash grab than the epic community-driven experience everyone was hoping for. But here's where Destiny 2 stands out. Bungie didn't let the backlash define the game. They leaned into player feedback, slowly but surely transforming Destiny 2 into the massive success it is today. Expansions like Forsaken and the Witch Queen gave the game the depth it desperately needed. The devs expanded the universe, added thrilling new content, and most importantly, built a consistent flow of updates that kept players engaged and excited. On top of that, Destiny 2's live service model got smarter. Bungie learned how to balance content releases with player progression, introducing seasonal updates that felt rewarding rather than exploitative. This kept the fanbase loyal, and over time, more and more players returned to the game, drawn by the promise of fresh content and a community that felt like it was truly being listened to. The key to Destiny 2's success? Bungie's ability to evolve and consistently deliver on what players want. wanted. They turned a game that was once criticized as shallow and money hungry into a universe players can't stop exploring. Destiny 2 became not just a game but a platform, an ever-expanding world that keeps drawing players back for more. The constant introduction of meaningful storylines, engaging seasonal activities, and significant gameplay improvements has kept the experience fresh and exciting. Bungie's willingness to take risks with new content and its commitment to refining existing systems have made Destiny 2 a dynamic and ever-evolving universe. The game's collaborative events, diverse content drops, and strong narrative direction have helped foster a loyal and engaged community that feels genuinely valued. It's a prime example of how a live service game, even after a shaky start, can dominate the industry by putting players first. When it comes to live service games, the line between success and failure is razor thin. For every Destiny 2 or Helldivers 2 that rises from the ashes, there's a Marvel's Avengers, Concord, or Kill the Justice League that crashes and burns. So what makes the difference? The truth is, live service games fail more often than they succeed, and it usually comes down to three core issues: content, communication, and community. Games like Battlefield 2042, Concord, or Kill the Justice League miss the mark because they don't deliver meaningful content. Players feel like they were getting shallow experiences, more focused on monetization and digging into our pockets than actual solid gameplay. Add in poor communication, where developers fail to listen to player feedback or take too long to implement changes, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Too often, developers prioritize greed and money over creating a genuinely enjoyable experience. Instead of focusing on making a game that people want to play, they push aggressive microtransactions, battle passes, and cosmetic purchases that feel exploitative. This focus on squeezing as much money as possible out of the player base without first building a solid, engaging game ultimately backfires. The truth is, if developers concentrated on crafting a game that players love, one that keeps them coming back for more, the monetization opportunities would naturally follow. We as video gamers are more than willing to spend money on a game we feel passionate about, where we see that our feedback is valued and the experience is worth investing in. The best live service games are those that put player satisfaction above quick profits, understanding that if they build a game people truly enjoy, the revenue will come. On the flip side, the live service games that succeed, Destiny 2, Helldivers 2, do so because they understand the importance of evolving alongside their player base. These games didn't launch perfectly. They faced harsh criticism early on, but what set them apart was the developers' ability to adapt. They listened to their communities, pushed out regular, meaningful updates, and created an ecosystem that makes players feel valued and invested in the game's future. But make no mistake, for every Helldivers 2, there are countless games that never make it past their first year. The live service model is a brutal arena, and only the games that prioritize their players, offer fresh content, and build a real connection with their communities have any chance of survival. It's a tough market, and as history has shown, the failures far outnumber the success stories. Thanks for sticking around for this deep dive into the world of live service games. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to stay updated on all our latest live streams, gaming breakdowns, and everything else we do. Your support means the world to me and helps me continue making videos like this. And remember, it's only GG when you win.